Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, the man responsible for the colony of San Miguel de Gualdape, was born in Toledo somewhere within the years of 1475 to 1480, to a prominent but not noble family, steeped in local government and law, dependent on their intelligence to get ahead in a rapidly changing world. For young Lucas, especially in his teenage years, he lived through the Reconquista under the combined kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, witnessing the birth of Spain and the discovery of a westward route over the Atlantic to the Indies, which of course we now know would actually be the Caribbean. But place yourself in the shoes of young Lucas or any Spaniard of the time. Providence would seem on your side. The same year the supposed infidels are expelled, God provides Spain with a route to Asia, and soon thereafter, Portugal and Spain divide the heathen areas of the globe between them. The optimism on the Iberian Peninsula must have hit a fevered pitch. Lucas de Ayllón arrives in the New World in 1502, along with a large group of people under the command of the new governor of the Indies, Nicolas de Ovando, on the island of Santo Domingo. Living up to his family name, de Ayllón made a name for himself as a mayor and magistrate, doing the same types of mid-level government work as his father and grandfather, being the men who actually keep the boat of government afloat without ever receiving the glory of being captain, so to speak. And that would be de Ayllón's life until 1509, when Ovando and his subordinates are recalled to Spain for a review of sorts of their conduct in the New World. As the Spanish Empire matured, the abuses of the Native Americans became a pressing concern in many circles of the Catholic Church, who wisely surmised it would be difficult to truly turn people to their faith through servitude and persecution. This, among other issues, would be the cause of the 1509 as well as another 1517 review. De Ayllón, a stickler for the rules, would come out clean each time. And in between each recall, he used his time in Spain, wisely, to attend the University of Salamanca, and he graduated there with a degree in law. From here on, he works as a bona fide judge on the island of Hispaniola, building on his reputation for fairness and having a thorough nature. It was de Ayllón in 1520 who was tasked with going to Mexico and convincing Narvaez to end his pursuit of Hernan Cortez. De Ayllón, not a military man, was promptly placed on a boat and shipped back east. This failure aside, on the island of Hispaniola, he also made his bones as an owner of a sugar plantation, which, yes, meant that de Ayllón used enslaved people for their labor. De Ayllón, like many in the Spanish New World, developed an opinion very different than that of Las Casas, even compared to his Spanish brethren back home, concerning the nature of slavery and who could be condemned to live as a slave. In de Ayllón's case, he reasoned that because some of the natives of the Caribbean practiced cannibalism, and I'll say less than kosher bedroom practices for the time, that these natives could be justifiably enslaved by their actions. Obviously, de Ayllón lived in a time very different than our own. The plantations of the Caribbean were in need of constant new slave labor. In this era, just after the time of Christopher Columbus and then his son Diego, it was the native peoples of the Americas who were reduced to enslavement in these Spanish colonies. And beyond the grueling labor and terrible conditions, the natives simply had little resistance to old world diseases, and unfortunately died by the millions. And as we learned in our last episode, the Spanish slavers scoured the North American coast to find new slaves to bring back to these plantations. De Ayllón would be no different. In 1521, he financed an expedition to find a good harbor under Captain Francisco Cordelia for a new colony. However, other sources indicate he actually sent out the captain on a slaving mission to the Bahamas. Either way, Cordelia joined forces with a certain Captain Pedro de Quexo, who, finding the Bahamas nearly void of a population, they sailed north to capture natives along the southeast coast of North America. Today, the American South, where Spanish slavers, such as Captain Pedro Salazar, noted how large the natives were compared to the natives of New Spain, and called the area the Land of Giants. Unfortunately for these robust people, to the Spanish this implied they would make for a hardier enslaved population. Cordelia and Quexos then capture two natives on the Pidi River at Winya Bay. These two they ply with gifts and send them back to their people. The Spaniards then lived with the natives for several days, and unknown to the natives, claimed the land for Spain. Gaining their trust, they lured a group of 60 to 70 people onto their boats and sailed away. The Ayllon was certainly not an abolitionist. However, he was a judge, and living in the Caribbean in the time immediately after the true chaos of the first impulse of Spanish colonization, the Ayllon knew that these natives were different from those taken in the Bahamas, and were enslaved under no legal pretense in the Spanish system, or according to his own system of morality, as we discussed before. And the attitude of the Spanish Empire now tilt towards ensuring peaceful relations with the newly encountered native groups, as the first step towards conversion and assimilation, ultimately. As such, he had both captains brought before Diego Colon, who we know as Diego Columbus, son of Christopher, governor of the Indies, who agreed that these people had been enslaved by illegal means and ordered the people returned to their homeland. But there is no evidence any of them were returned. It appears that these poor souls were simply free to wander Hispaniola, with one key exception. The Ayllon had taken in one of the captured natives, who picked up quickly on the Spanish language and found that he received better treatment than the others for telling tales about his homeland of Chicora, likely the Shikori tribe of South Carolina, though this is hotly debated, so don't take this as gospel, or somewhere in the surrounding area. The more fanciful the stories, the more attention he gained, becoming the Ayllon's personal assistant. He received a baptism and adopted the name of Francisco de Chicora. The others, who were freed, supposedly, they lived as vagrants on the island. Many died within a year or two, never making it home. As such, it is easy to understand the motivation of Francisco in telling tales that may have been a little bit more than truth. In 1523, the Ayllon gains an audience with the Spanish king himself, seeking to settle the east coast of North America. He takes Francisco with him, who through his storytelling prowess now is able to talk to King Carlos directly about all the fanciful things from his homeland and surrounding areas. The Spanish historian Peter Martyr was allowed to interview Francisco. Here are a few of his more colorful stories. The testimony of Francisco de Chicora. Another country near Duhari is called Zapida. Pearls are found there, and also a kind of stone resembling pearls, which is much prized by the Indians. In all these regions they visited, the Spaniards noticed herds of deer similar to herds of cattle. These deer bring forth and nourish their young in the houses of the natives. During the daytime, they wander freely through the woods in search of their food, and in the evening, they come back to their little ones, who have been cared for, allowing themselves to be shut up in the courtyards and even to be milked. When they have suckled their fawns, the only milk the natives know is that of the does, from which they make cheese. There is another country called Inzignanen, whose inhabitants declare that according to the traditions of their ancestors, there once arrived among them men with tails, a meter long, as thick as a man's arm. The tail was not movable like those of quadrupeds, but formed one mass, as we see in the case with fish and crocodiles, and was hard as a bone. When these men wished to sit down, they had, consequently, to have sat upon an open bottom, and if there were none, they had to dig a hole more than a cubit deep to hold their tails and allow them to rest. Their fingers were as long as they were broad, and their skin was rough, almost scaly. They ate nothing but raw fish, and when the fish gave out, they all perished, leaving no descendants. These fables and other similar nonsense have been handed down to the natives by their parents. At the same time, Francisco peppered his tall tales with bits of the truth, providing us today with anthropological information about his people. The inhabitants of this country do not eat human flesh. The prisoners of war are enslaved by the victors. The Spaniards have visited several regions of that vast country. They are called Arambe, Guacacia, Cothathe, Tazaca, and Tathor. The color of the inhabitants is dark brown. None of them have any system of writing, but they preserve traditions of great antiquity in rhymes and chants. Dancing and physical exercises are held in honor, and they are passionately fond of ball games, in which they exhibit the greatest skill.
The women know how to spin and sew, although they are partially clothed with the skins of wild beasts. They use cloth, such as the Milanese called bombasio, and they make nets of fiber of a certain tough grass, just as hemp and flax are used for the same purposes in Europe.
Peter Martyr ends his account with,
Thanks to us and the royal counselor, the Ayllon succeeded in obtaining what he wanted. His Imperial Majesty accepted our advice, and we have sent him back to New Spain, authorizing him to build a fleet to carry him to those countries where he will found a colony. Associates will not fail him, for the entire Spanish nation is in fact so keen about the novelties that people go eagerly anywhere they are called by a nod or a whistle, in the hope of bettering their condition, and are ready to sacrifice what they have for what they hope.
King Carlos specified that the land of Chicora would be everything in North America between 35 and 37 degrees north latitude, which vaguely covers the northern half of North Carolina into southern Virginia today. The Ayllon's contract held him to 3 specific requirements. First, he was to make a settlement on the east coast. Secondly, find a way to court favor with the natives. A distant third mission was to at least attempt to find a middle passage to Asia. In return, the Ayllon would receive a monopoly on all exports of the colony. Much like in our last episode on Ponce de Leon, the Ayllon would undertake the founding of his colony at his own expense, being made adelantado, a Spanish governor who also had proprietary rights. In this way, the Spanish Empire could expand on the back of private investment. Now, the king specified that no natives were to be enslaved unless taken as of a result of war. As such, the Ayllon did resolve to buy native captives from their enemies. Meanwhile, the Franciscans were to spearhead the friendly conversion of the native population. Now, de Ayllon's plans were somewhat delayed, again because he was a judge and a local politician and local magistrate. He wasn't a conquistador. He wasn't exactly an explorer. He wasn't a sailor. These delays caused others to seek permission to conduct similar colonial schemes. Throughout the years of 1524 and 25, he is told by the royal court to act on his claim as soon as he can, as the French Empire, as you can hear in Season 2 of this show, suddenly took great interest in North America. And in 1524, Giovanni de Verrazzano, working for the French, very courageously in a single ship, mapped the entire east coast of what would now be from parts of Florida to New Brunswick, Canada. The French were coming, and the crown expected de Ayllon to do something about it. And so in 1525, he resolved to send out Captain Quexos, a man he formerly turned over to Diego Columbus for illegally enslaving the natives, but who nonetheless knew the region in question, to survey the coast, much like Verrazzano. He was to also kidnap natives to use as interpreters, which was actually a very common practice for the time, and install stone markers that claimed the land for Spain. I couldn't find any information on whether we today have any of these markers. Perhaps this will serve as a call to action to a restless listener, and as a hint, I know that the French did something similar in the 1560s and placed their markers at the mouth of the attractive waterways. That may be a good place to start. Quexos maps all the way up to modern-day Delaware, returning with more captive natives and just the smallest bits of gold and silver. We now know that precious goods like copper or pearls were traded over very long distances of the North American continent. The gold and silver taken from natives of modern-day Delaware could have come from half a continent away, traded slowly between many groups, the end of the line not necessarily even knowing where the supply chain began. Quexos' report from his first and second expedition painted a picture of a placid land full of peaceful people. Francisco's stories fed him further details that convinced de Ayllon that the region could become Spanish through persuasion and not through the sword. De Ayllon assembled 6 or 7 ships. He brought missionaries, barber surgeons, enslaved Africans taken from the plantations of the Caribbean, and enslaved natives. All in all, the historian J.G. Johnson points out that de Ayllon brought 600 people, meaning more people to Chicora than Cortez did landing in Mexico. Cortez, though, brought soldiers. De Ayllon did not see the need. This, for me, is the Ayllon's real blind spot. As a man of the law and not of war, he nonetheless was present to witness the final subjugation of the natives on Hispaniola. He should have known that in law and order usually precedes law. Anyway, de Ayllon's fleet leaves in July of 1526 from Santo Domingo, spending a great deal of time at sea. One reason for this is that de Ayllon's pilot, Diego Marullo, a man we met in our last episode on Ponce de Leon, formally scouted out a good harbor that he named Santa Elena, but was now dumbfounded by his inability to find it once more. Searching the coast, he grew depressed for having disappointed so many people. He then quickly grew ill and died. De Ayllon would now have to rely on Francisco, who would see to it that the Spaniards would deliver him straight back to where they had stole him from in the first place. They arrive at Winyah Bay on August 9th. Their largest ship hit upon a sandbar and sunk. The people on board were saved, but many of their supplies and much of their food were lost to the sea. Nevertheless, de Ayllon begins building along a river the Spanish named the Jordan River, which, according to Francisco, led upstream to the land of Duhare and beyond to the gem-filled kingdom of Zapiria. And yet, what actually surrounded the young settlement were pine barrens, and not a native in sight. De Ayllon ordered the men to build a gabara to replace their lost ship, little more than a very large rowboat. The men used this vessel to search the riverways, finding nothing of note. Francisco and the other natives, likely part of one of these expeditions, quickly used the opportunity to abandon the colony, running straight into the forest. De Ayllon, bewildered, spent some time at this location, with half his mind set on continuing to build here, the other half mulling over some of the more promising locations he cited on their inbound journey. As the days passed, not only did Francisco fail to resurface, but de Ayllon found no natives at all. Many assume Francisco warned off the local population, which seems likely, but we can't be sure. And then the men began dying of dysentery, which, among other things, involves a violent amount of pooping. The location also proved to be unseasonably cold, and without natives to trade with for food, they weren't going to last long. De Ayllon resolved to move further south, taking the drastic measure to relocate the colony, abandoning the site, and because he no longer had all of his ships, he made a portion of his healthier population walk the distance. Many historians surmise to be around 175 to 200 miles, likely stopping around Sapelo Sound, Georgia. But again, the actual location of anything in this story is heavily debated. De Ayllon decides to finally make a settlement, settling on either September 29th or October 8th of 1526. And again, we had different calendar systems and different historians recorded things differently. Either way, it was far too late in the year to plant crops. He names his colony San Miguel de Gualdape. The people again start building a new settlement, reportedly constructing a church and a few houses, but the people never truly recovered from their ailments that they contracted at their former settlement. And de Ayllon himself falls ill, but still has faith in the future success of his colony. In the case of his death, he appointed his nephew in Puerto Rico as his successor, and then he passes away on October 18th. His nephew being too far away and completely unaware of his inheritance, de Ayllon's council selects Captain Francisco Gomez as the colony's temporary leader, resolving to forge ahead with the settlement. After all, with all the nooks and crannies along the coastline of North America, a middle passage to Asia could still be just around a river bend. However, a cabal coalesced around the man by the name of Ginés Doncel, who led a rebellion against Gomez and his council, captured them, and imprisoned them in his house. Around this time, a number of the colonists also made first contact with a native village nearby. With famine setting in, the colonists quickly turned to violence to extract food from the natives, who responded in kind, killing an unspecified amount of the Spaniards. The enslaved African population, seeing conditions go from bad to worse under the rebel regime, break into Doncel's house, free Gomez and the council, and then burn Doncel's house to the ground. In the chaotic battle that ensued, the rebels were killed, except for the more prominent among them, such as Doncel, who would receive a proper execution. Between the hostile natives, famine, disease, rebellion, and counter-rebellion, the colonists saw no way forward, and the colony, it was decided, would now be abandoned. The people prepared what they could for the journey, and ship by ship, they trickled back into the Caribbean, completely depopulating the colony by the end of November. All in all, de Ayllon's roving colony lasted less than 6 months. Of the 600 people who arrived, about 150 returned to the Caribbean. During a particularly cold fall and winter, the historian Oviedo records a horrifying scene on one of these returned ships.
In the caravel Santa Catalina, 7 men froze to death. On the ship Choruca, something occurred hardly ever seen before at all. One of the poor souls wanted to take his breeches off, and all the flesh came away from both legs, from the knees downward, leaving his bones bare.
And he died that night.
De Ayllon, much like Ponce de Leon, left his family in massive debt. Had the colony succeeded, the generational wealth created might be measurable to this day. As it was, they were left poorer than ever. His son tried to recover these rights and restart the colony. This went nowhere, and his son dies in failure, but it did keep Narvaez, who we will meet in our next episode, from invading the area still under de Ayllon's claim. Narvaez had a devastating effect on the native populations he met along the way, and de Ayllon inadvertently gave the natives within his claim a pass, at least for a while, from the direct effects of these Spanish explorers. The effect on history and the present being ultimately unknowable, but probably not nothing. Additionally, any of the enslaved Africans who escaped their bondage during any point in this chaotic story were perhaps the first African immigrants to what we would now call the contiguous continental United States, hopefully being accepted among the local natives. But again, their fate is unknowable. We often focus on men and women who take huge risks and succeed. What makes these stories so remarkable is in fact stories such as this, where massive failure is the result of massive risk. I'm Eric Yanis. If you like this podcast, please give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tune in next time for our continuing story on the creation of Spanish Florida. Thank you for listening.